Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. So pleased to have you here tonight. My name is Valerie Paley, and I am Senior Vice President and the Sue Ann Weinberg Director of this library. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to Primary Source, a series of free and public programs exploring how our library supports new research and historical inquiry. For over 200 years, the library has documented our shared history through manuscripts, books, maps, newspapers, photographs, architectural drawings, prints, and more. These primary sources are available to researchers, students, and all those curious about our past and present. Before we begin, I'd like to thank New York Historical's Board of Trustees, its chair, Agnes Xu Tang, our chair's council members, our members, and the Leon Levy Foundation for their generous ongoing support of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library and our programs. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Lynne Sagalyn. Lynne is an expert in real estate. I pronounced it right, I think. Lynne is an expert in real estate, development, and finance, and the Earl W. Kazis and Benjamin Shore Professor Emerita of Real Estate at Columbia Business School. She is the author of Times Square Roulette, Remaking the City Icon, Power at Ground Zero, Politics, Money, and the Remaking of Lower Manhattan, and the focus of tonight's discussion, Times Square Remade, the Dynamics of Urban Change. Her papers for both Power at Ground Zero and her work on Times Square are part of the archival collections at New York Historical, where they inform and enrich new generations of scholarship. Lynne has generously signed copies of Times Square Remade, which are available for purchase after the program downstairs in the New York History Store. Lynne is joined by my colleague, Meredith Mann, New York Historical's Curator of Manuscripts and Archival Collections. Here in the Klingenstein Library, we are proud to collect and preserve materials related to Times Square's history. Our screen tonight features images from several of our photography collections documenting this dynamic and contested space. Please join me in welcoming Lynne and Meredith.
All right, thank you, Valerie. So Lynne, I thought that we could get started by talking about the title of your book. And I realize that by saying this, I sound like a student who has a paper and hasn't read it. But so we will talk about the book. But you know, in the books that you've written, this idea of remaking is kind of a constant among them. So can you tell us a little bit about what draws you to that idea and why you chose to focus on Times Square for your current project?
When you asked me that question, it made me look back to all the books, and I have used remaking several times. And there's a reason. You know, cities are about change, and both socially, physically, economically, politically, for sure. And as somebody who studied urban studies and planning, I was always interested in writing about cities, and in particular understanding the politics of how they change. And one of the devices I've always used is to pick a big project, like the 42nd Street redevelopment project. The Ground Zero project fell in my lap. I was sort of the obvious person to write that story. But if you take a big project that everybody has some visual or personal contact with because they live in the city, and you explain it, then it resonates with them. And so I've always wanted to pick a big project to tell that story about how cities change. And
it's hard to think of a bigger project than Times Square.
And you know, the first book started when I moved back to New York. I'm a New Yorker by birth. And, you know, I moved back to the city after living in Massachusetts for 20 years. And I said, oh, what project can I really dig my brain into and get back to the city of my birth? And that was, in 1990, the first plan for the redevelopment of 42nd Street was dead in the water. It was, and nobody thought there was a chance to resurrect it. except Prudential Insurance Company did something that nobody in the real estate world thought they should do, but they did it. They put down a $240 million letter of credit to secure the condemnation of basically the 4 office sites on 42nd and 7th and Broadway. But otherwise, it was dead in the water for a few years, but only a few.
So when we think of Times Square, at least when I think of Times Square, I feel like it's really dominated by these 2 phases. There sort of the Deuce period, which we were seeing a lot of on the screen, and then the current iteration of Times Square, where it's LED screens everywhere, it's Disney equivalent characters everywhere. But your book takes a really long view from its very beginnings before it was even known as Times Square. So I wonder if you could, for our audience, kind of walk us through not to consolidate your very thorough book,
Very sketchy.
but just to give us a bird's eye view maybe of
Right.
its development.
The bird's eye view follows this kind of time path. You had, at the late 19th century, Times Square was Longacre Square, and it was a place for horse trading and for carriage trade and all the kind of livery activities that went about that. I don't know when it started, but basically when Oscar Hammerstein first, Sr., built the Olympia up at 45th Street, and that was the beginning of the end of the livery business at Times Square. And so that was the late 19th century. By 1900, theaters were populating and were moving up from the Rialto at 34th and 36th Street, and they were populating 42nd Street. So between 1900 and 1928, this was a fiercely competitive business, building theaters. There were 44 theaters built by 1920 in the first 2 decades. But that wasn't the end of it. And 8 years later, another 19 had been built. I mean, this was kind of ruinous competition. It made no economic sense to build 76 theaters in this one confined space. But there was a competition between the theater syndicate and a bunch of the independent theater builders, and they built, and they built. And the price of overbuilding didn't come due until the Depression, and then it did. So you had the livery, you had the carriage trade period, you had this intense period from 1900 to 1928 when all the theaters were built, and then the Times Square subway opened in 1904, which really made Times Square what it is. It was the combination of theater and the subway, which brought people from all over the area. And it's easy. And one of the things that we tend to forget, because the east side of Midtown is so well developed, but the first part of Midtown to develop was Times Square, was the west side of Midtown. And it was only after Grand Central Terminal, the third one, opens in 1913, does the east side of Midtown really begin to be developed. And that really happens in the 1920s. So the third period was the Depression and Prohibition and World War II, which kind of put the kibosh on Times Square, except that there was this one period, and this answers your question, that really most people don't know a lot about unless you've got really gray hair like I have, is the honky-tonk era. There was this honky-tonk, Times Square was kind of like Coney Island in the 40s. All the wartime armed services people and their families would come to Times Square for the entertainment. And of course, Prohibition and the Depression had really shut down a lot of activities. So what rose up in its midst was all this kind of Coney Island kind of honky-tonk stuff with shooting galleries and Herbert's Fleece Museum, Dime Museum, and Flea Circus. This was very upsetting to the politicians and the real estate interests. And there were a series of efforts to basically zone out the honky-tonk, which they eventually did, by attrition. They wouldn't let any new ones come in, but they could not really, they grandfathered all the old ones. So you had that period, and then you had, and that period lasts until the 50s, and then the 60s it changes. And then that's the, the porn and the crime, in which we're all well familiar with. And only if you look back with nostalgia do you think that was a good time. But there's a lot of nostalgia, believe it or not, about that time. And then you had the transformation era. So you really had these 5 distinct periods of the Times Square.
And what do you think it was, when we look at the livery period and the theater period, what was it about the area that made it a magnet for that type of development activity?
That's a good question, because the livery period, if you think about it, let's call it the post-Civil War era. The post-Civil War era, all of New York, which is still New York and not New York City, all of New York is really south of, I've got to say, Houston or Canal Street. I mean, the movement up north hadn't really, it starts sometime in the 1860s, 1870s, but they're still building all the skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan. And the Rialto, the theater district keeps moving. But the Metropolitan Opera House, which was on 36th, it's still far north, and so I think, my supposition would be the livery business was where the land was cheap, and where you had expansive opportunities to house horses. And, the New York City Mounted Police Brigade was still over on the West Midtown until probably the 70s, maybe. So, I mean, we tend to forget that West Midtown was really a whole different world from Central Midtown and East Midtown. It was pretty rough over there.
One of the things that I like about your book is that it considers Times Square in the context of the neighborhood around it, and specifically I'm talking about Hell's Kitchen and how the attention to Times Square and the development interest in Times Square encompassed, if you were looking just at those blocks, you're only getting a part of the picture, that you need to look at its effect on the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen as well. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what the nature of that relationship was between this super commercial, glitzy center and then, a more residential area, and how the kind of fate of Times Square had an effect on Hell's Kitchen as well.
Yeah. One of my real motives for doing a second book on Times Square was to understand the impact of change beyond 42nd Street, beyond Times Square Central. So the story of Hell's Kitchen is really fascinating, because it was a world apart from Times Square. It was, you might use today's language, a bedroom community. It was where all of the actors and actresses and the stage managers and the electricians and all of the stage people, the costume and wig makers, they all lived there. It was cheap. You had a lot of inexpensive rooming houses. It was walk to work. It had all the desirable attributes of what we want in a neighborhood that's close to where you work. But it was totally different. It was a very ethnically diverse community, and because not only did you have all of the theater employment located, nearby, but you also had all the workers and the families of those who were still working on the waterfront, where you had a lot of manufacturing still going on or tapering off, and shipping businesses and warehouses. And so it was a very close-knit, ethnically diverse community that was a world apart from this commercial entertainment zone one block away. And the transformation of Hell's Kitchen really started in the late 80s, but did not take off to what we see today, which is what I call super gentrification, until there was clarity that 42nd Street was going to actually succeed in being transformed into a different place than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there's a whole clear pattern of that trajectory of change. And I could talk a little bit more later if we have time about it.
I'm also curious what you mean when you say super gentrification. What are the characteristics that you're thinking of there?
It's now got all the hallmarks of gentrification. First of all, Hell's Kitchen was unusual as a neighborhood community because it was always fearful of change. Its location right next to Times Square made it an opportune spot for residential change. And when the city elected officials wanted to build a convention center over a little closer to 42nd Street than it is now, Hell's Kitchen managed to negotiate a special zoning district to protect the core of Hell's Kitchen as low-density residential. But the other thing that the zoning did was create a high-density corridor on 42nd and 43rd Streets. So now what you see is a phalanx of high-rise towers there. You know, I have a colleague of mine who was an urban designer, and he said, with zoning, you get what you ask for, you know? And city got exactly what it asked for. But the core of Hell's Kitchen still has that low-density neighborhood feel, but you have you have really high upscale apartment houses, you have upscale restaurants, you have all the attributes of a gentrified neighborhood, but mixed in with some of the old, I don't know how many of the old grocers and ethnic food shops are still there. There are a few hanging on, but it was ripe for change. It was ripe for change.
Well, speaking of things being ripe for change, when, a lot of the photos that, this one, for example, a lot of the ones that we've been looking at in the slideshow, we're looking at billboards, we're looking at, today, if you're walking through Times Square, you're seeing giant LED screens. We think of it as a place for entertainment and advertising, but I wonder if we could talk a little about, I mentioned to you that we have at least one Art Craft Strauss fan in the audience. And so, thinking of Times Square as a place of technological innovation, because really the people who were advertising here were pushing the envelope of what we were capable of doing to attract attention. And there's a lot of competition for eyeballs in Times Square. So, and you talk a little bit in your book about the different phases of billboard advertising. So I wonder if we could share a little.
The signage in Times Square is what everybody, even New Yorkers, continue to love, even through all the changes. And, you can go there, whatever night you go there, it's just, it's mesmerizing. And it's been that way since the first signs were lit with electric lights, which, and there's this whole transformation of signage in Times Square. You go from electric lights to neon, and then you go to animated neon signs, like the Wrigley's Spearmint Chewing Gum, or you have the mechanical Camel Man smoking. And, the story behind the camel and the smoking rings is that during war, that sign came out during the war. I don't know if Tamas Star told me this or I read it, but you couldn't really use lights as much. So the question was, how are you going to light up this cigarette? And so Douglas Lee, who was one of the most inventive signage people, came up with the idea of these smoke rings, which was not a light per se. It was just, some kind of, smoke. I'm not the most technical person. I can't tell you how they did the smoke rings. But then, from the neon and the animation, you had the spectacular light productions, like the Camel smoker. And then you had Spectacolor and the big screen, and then you had the Sony Jumbotron, and then you had the emergence of LED, the humongous sign on the Marriott marquee. The humongous sign does one thing, it covers an awful building. I mean, but the signage, just every turn of the screw of a technological invention, it's manifest in Times Square. And the interesting thing about the signage in Times Square is that if you trace the history of it and what's being advertised, it's just a profile, a reflection of our changing culture in this country. And when the transformation of 42nd Street and Times Square happened, wouldn't you know it that the first kind of signs to come up were financial services? You had the Morgan Stanley sign, and you had Reuters, and then you had NASDAQ. You had finance being advertised in Times Square. And that's not surprising because people, Americans, were just totally enthralled by the 1990s with finance and how the stock market was doing, you know? So the signage is really a reflection of our national culture, and I think that may be why all of us continue to find it fascinating to go there.
When you mentioned Spectacolor, and I think that another kind of interesting facet of billboard history in Times Square is its use as a mechanism for communicating art. You know, that it's not that, you know, you had Jenny Holzer's art being broadcast to people walking around. I know that you document in the, you know, the era after, you know, during COVID, you had artists like Duke Riley who were advertising isn't the right word, but who were communicating, who were depicting.
That was the objective of Spectacolor.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, I mean, George Stonebelly believed that you use Spectacolor as a communication medium. And Holzer was perfect for that. But it was really Jane Dixon who was working for Spectacolor. She's an artist, a really terrific artist. And it was her idea. She went to George and said, I'd like to you know, do this kind of art show on Spectacolor. And he said, fine. But his view was not just advertisement, was use it as communication and to use it as a message board, which became a message board during the 2016 election, and then it became a message board about the 2020 election, and it certainly was a message board during COVID.
And it can even be a provocation, too.
Pardon me?
It was sometimes quite provocative, the messages that were broadcast.
It was very provocative. In fact, I tried to put pictures of the most provocative advertisements in. There was one for Pornhub, but I couldn't get permission, so I just wrote about it. But there are a lot of provocative signs, and why not? Where else would you go to put up a provocative sign, you know? And it was the beginning era of clicks, you know. So they wanted everybody to sort of, you know, take pictures of it. It wasn't the old advertisement; it was all the new world of advertisement of clicks.
So you mentioned sources, so maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about your process for writing this book, because you consulted so many sources. Flipping through, you worked here, you were down the street at NYPL, I mean, every New York institution. I was also, every time I saw a collection of the author in a citation, I got excited because I know that your collection will be coming
You should
here.
get the little piece over there.
Oh, yeah?
Meredith asked me, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, so, you know, there's sort of not a source that I haven't tried, both primary sources. And in the first book in Times Square, I was really fortunate because people who were involved gave me access to primary documents that I didn't have to go through FOIL to get. I had internal memos. I had copies of the agreements between the city and the state, and the city and the state and the developers. I had an enormous amount of materials, all of which will now reside here because they have the archives for both the Times Square books and the Ground Zero books. So I had all these primary documents. I had enormous files. I had to invent my own, methods of keeping track of all these things. I also used a lot of photographs to kind of, as a resource, as a real, to understand the time of something when I didn't know. But, if you look at the movie marquees and they say the movies, you can figure out the year that the movies were playing. I was very fortunate. I've had all of my work in New York City, I've had access to people. And so for the Times Square book, I must have interviewed both of them over 200 people. And those interviews are here too. They're embargoed for while I'm alive, but they too will be a scholarly research. And people were really forthcoming. The thing about taking a big project like 42nd Street Development Project, Times Square, or Ground Zero is that people, at least in this city, want to tell their story. And I started early, when it was still fresh in their memories. It wasn't sort of retrospective, 20 years later. And so those interviews, I could not write these books without these people, without people willing to sort of talk to me. And they trusted me. I'm not a journalist. I don't have a slant. I just want to put it out there and understand what it means. So I had enormous files. And, but it was the old-fashioned way of doing research, people and documents.
It takes a long time, but
Takes a
it's
very
worth
long
the
time.
effort.
I mean, part of, the first Times Square book took me 12 years because I was writing current history. It was ongoing, and then it failed, and then it resurrected, and, so it takes, but it takes a long time because you always have to cross-check, reference, what one person says against the documents. But I'll tell you one thing that they don't tell you when you get a PhD and you want to do research is that talking to people goes hand in hand with the documents, because when you hear the stories of the people who were the actors in these projects, it gives you a much better understanding of how to read the documents, because you can understand the nuances. It's like reading between the lines of what it really means, and especially if they're legal documents, because the lawyers are not writing to make it clear for you. They're, and the financing for the 42nd Street Remade project, as well as Ground Zero, is the most complex in a world of complexity in real estate finance. These were incredibly complex, and so and I taught finance, and I still thought they were complex. Having people explain, them was really, really valuable.
And I think that's a experience that will resonate with a lot of folks who do archival research, because sometimes, it's so exciting. How could you not want to jump right into these original primary sources, to these original documents? But sometimes you open up the box and then you open up the folder and you're looking at the document and you're just saying, what is this? What am I looking at? I don't have the framework, the context to understand the significance of this. And so doing that background research, doing those interviews gives you those tools to be able to,
Yes.
and it's an iterative thing, I'm sure.
But one of the things when you write about a complex project, you have to start by creating your own chronology in great detail, because the documents aren't going to give that to you. You have to take all these different sources and construct a chronology and go from there. But that's the fun. That's the fun part of research. It's a puzzle, and you have to figure it out with all these different sources.
So as you were constructing this structure for this chronology for your research, was there a document that made you have to completely reimagine it, or was there anything that surprised you, in your research that you weren't expecting to find?
Well, I tell you, one of the interesting sources, which I didn't mention, is that New York City not only provides transcripts of their public hearings, but they provide videos. So there was a big kerfuffle about the costume characters once the pedestrianization of Times Square went into effect. And this became yes, it was the painted nude ladies, but it was the whole scene that was very upsetting to all different kinds of interests. And so a couple of councilmen decided that maybe we should license the costume characters. Well, that was really an interesting thought. And so I read thousands of pages, it seemed, of transcripts, because there were like 3 different public sets of hearings. And after I read these, they were kind of very dry, you know. I decided, well, maybe I should look at the videos. Well, that was really illuminating. I hadn't expected that because, you know, if you go to a public hearing in New York, it's kind of theater. It's sort of always entertaining, and it's serious, but it's also entertaining. And several of the costume characters came in costume to the public hearings on the licensing of the costume characters. So, but the videos were really valuable because you could see people's body language, you could hear the intonation of their voices when they were testifying, and so it gave you all these kind of nuanced aspects of the transcript, which you would never get by just reading the black and white transcripts. And so I think we're lucky in New York that they will spend the money to do the videos as well as the transcripts. And that was a surprise. Using those videos was really a surprise. So
I think this is also a lesson to writers that if you keep digging, even if you think you've found the source already, you had the transcript, you thought you had the record of what went on, and if you keep digging and you know, look, it's like a Rashomon thing almost. If you look at that same event through a different lens, it can completely change your interpretation of events.
it does, and it's good to have a surprise because it sort of lightens the days where you sit by yourself in front of the computer screen.
Well, I have a couple more questions for you, Lynne, and then we're going to open it up to our audience. So all of our attendees here can start mulling over the questions that they want to ask you. But one question I had was, so downstairs, we have our exhibition Lost New York, and where we're looking at bygone places and activities and areas of New York City. And you know, in your book, you say something here, I have your direct quote here, something along the lines of New York is well-versed in the process of renewal, something like that. That New York City is well-practiced in the mission of renewal. And so I'd like to know, you know, Times Square, just like New York City, is ever-changing. Are there aspects of Times Square's past that you miss, that you mourn, that you do have some nostalgia for, and what do you think Times Square tells us about our relationship as New Yorkers with memory and with history?
Let me answer that in 2 ways. One, I think that
Get your mic a little.
everybody who grows up in a city has
Yeah, just closer.
farther away.
Closer.
Okay. Everybody who grows up in a city has some innate intelligence about that city. It's not learned. It's just by osmosis you develop this sense of how things work in your city. And that's the way I feel I can write about New York because I grew up here. I lived in Boston for 20 years, but I can't write about Boston the same way I can write about New York. At Times Square, you know, Times Square is symbolic for New York because it encapsulates the energy, the spontaneity, the unpredictability of the city, and its sheer competition, its sheer competitiveness. Did I answer your question in the way you expected? Or do you want me to read this paragraph?
I want you to answer it in whatever way you want to answer it. But I would love it. So there is a passage from your book that I think that you'll be reading for us now, because one of the things that you're grappling with is this idea of, you know, Times Square it's a tourist destination. And so a lot of times people who live in New York don't really go to Times Square that much because it's crowded and they need to get to work. And so we have an interesting relationship with the space where it's in the center of our city, but a lot of the times we're passing through or around. And so I think that you address that really movingly in your book.
It's a good way to end our part of our conversation. Times Square, it's become conventional wisdom to say that New Yorkers never go to Times Square, okay? And because we're not really comfortable with the changes. So this is what Meredith wants me to read that I wrote as I grappled with it myself. So it's still, as it has come to feel too touristy, Times Square has become less and less a place for New Yorkers. Its new status as a safe destination and its heavy corporate veneer has made more than a few New Yorkers question whether the city was going soft, losing some of its legendary toughness, its moxie, its grit, something authentic if not unique. Where was the allure? The new Times Square is not edgy. It's not cutting edge, and even visitors want more of that, more of what they perceive New York to be. The pedestrianization of the bow tie, a major initiative of the Bloomberg administration, further exacerbated the tensions, especially for those who live and work there. Where is the balance, the legacy? Can Times Square reestablish itself as a place for New Yorkers? Even at its nadir of tawdriness, Times Square was an authentic New York place. It's a place that needs New Yorkers to be a New York place. The fear among many today is that Times Square might be slipping, or maybe has slipped, out of the day-to-day life of New Yorkers. The fear among planners and real estate professionals, who do not always see eye to eye, is that Times Square could turn into a single-focused tourist zone, which would undermine the economic force behind 42nd Street's transformative development. That's actually the fear, I think, that many of us have. We don't want New York's Times Square to be only a tourist zone, and yet it's unclear how you get back that kind of balance. We'll see. COVID threw a big, left-hand curve into Times Square, but all this kind of change takes a while to sort through.
Well, I'd love to open this up to questions, and my colleague Sarah is going to be available with a handheld mic, so she'll come over to you if you want to raise your hand, just so we can hear you and so that our recording and future viewers of this program can hear you.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation. You've talked about Times Square without mentioning how Times Square got named. It's remarkable how few people know why it's called Times Square. So I'd like to ask you a question about that and also about Hell's Kitchen. You mentioned Hell's Kitchen, so the other side of 8th Avenue in the 40s and lower 50s. How did Hell's Kitchen become known as Hell's Kitchen, even though the city wanted to change it to what?
Nobody really knows how Hell's Kitchen got its name. There's one story that, do you know the real story? I mean, the one story is that the police, in the 19th century, it was not exactly a tame area on the west side. And I can't remember the line, but you...
sorry, I can't.
The mic back.
If the story is correct, it's a young cop and an older cop, and the young cop is a rookie, and they're walking through what is now known as Hell's Kitchen, where all of the meat was being slaughtered and all this stuff was and the rookie looks to the older cop as they're walking through, and he says, This place is like hell. And the older cop looks down and says, no, son, this isn't hell. This is Hell's Kitchen.
It was always a place where there were lots of bordellos. lots of bordellos.
And of course, the Times Square moniker, we have a much more documented history as to why it received the name Times Square. or because it was chosen as the headquarters of the New York
Well, it was
Times.
chosen for Times
Yeah.
Square, but what I didn't know until I read the Morgenthau biography was that Henry Morgenthau Sr. told your ancestor that he should go to Longacre Square for the new headquarters. I didn't know that. I would have put it in the book had I, but that came afterwards. Henry Morgenthau Sr. was a well-known real estate. Senior was a well-known real estate.
Oh, yeah.
Was a well-known real estate operator, who, along with Astor, bought a lot of the Manhattan.
Yeah. Likewise, Herald Square, because the New York Herald was based there.
Hi, great talk. Broadway theaters seem to be a real constant in Times Square. Broadway theaters.
What about Broadway
They
theaters?
seem to be a constant in the history of Times Square. I mean, I remember going, you know, in the tawdry days of the 60s with my family to Times Square, and there was such a contrast between the diciness of the neighborhood and the legitimate, you know, theater. And in fact, there were some nice restaurants then too. And I think New Yorkers, or New Yorkers with means, continued to patronize Broadway theater in the 60s, in those decades.
They
And-
do, but the question is, do they come for dinner before, and do they stay?
Well, in
out?
those years back, I don't know what's happening now. And then when you talk about is Times Square for tourists and not for native New Yorkers, I'm a native New Yorker. I only go to Times Square when I go to see a play. So I'm wondering about the thread of legitimate Broadway theaters in the history of Times Square. They persisted there. They didn't seem to move. I guess they moved a little bit to the low 50s, but not much.
I mean, the theater industry is absolutely central to Times Square. And, you know, there's a debate among historians whether it's the transportation that made Times Square or whether it was the theater. And I'm on the side of Mike Wallace, who argues that it's the theaters that made Times Square. And it was so close in time with the subway that the two were, you know, together were a double force. But it's entertainment more so than just legitimate theater, because those 76 theater structures I mentioned that were in place by 1928, many of them were playhouses for movies or vaudeville. I mean, it wasn't just legitimate theater as we know it. Times Square is built upon a broad base of entertainment, types of entertainment. And, you know, movies put a dent in legitimate theater because they were more exciting for many people, for the mass populace, not for everybody, for sure. But, and you had these incredible movie palaces built, the Roxy, the Strand, you know, Capitol, incredible theaters. Almost all of them have been destroyed.
Also, isn't part of the current problem with Times Square now, again, a technology problem? They got the right to build all these large office buildings there that, while they may have had theaters and facilities for people on the street down below, upstairs they're suffering the same problem that a lot of cities are having now with getting people to come back to work, because you no longer need to be in the office all the time. I notice, I work in tourism, and I'm telling you, I used to say the worst days for traffic were Wednesdays and Fridays. Wednesdays was characteristic of New York because the matinees was when stores had sales, you were going to meet your friends. You often did it on Wednesdays. And Fridays was true everywhere. But now it's really Thursdays. Thursdays are almost worse than Fridays in tourism. And it is true, in Times Square, the tourism is booming, but it doesn't seem to me the offices are doing that well.
No, there is Times Square is suffering the office problem along with other areas of Manhattan. You know, it's 25 years since those were the newest office buildings in town. And now you have, Hudson Yards, and you have pretty much Hudson Yards, and then you'll soon have East Midtown as competition. And there's, the buildings are being tenanted, not with the same class of tenants that were first in there. You're not getting the big law firms, you're getting second tier, what people in the brokerage business would say are second tier tenants. They're still good tenants, they're still paying the rent, maybe not as high, but it is a problem. And the office developers, the office owners went back to the city asking for a second round of tax abatements, and they were denied that, reasonably so. Tax abatements are a stimulus to get, economic development moving, but they're not an infinite giving, So that it's a problem. It's a problem, but, it's not unique to Times Square. Some of the buildings, what Times Square has going for it is still location, And that's what I meant by location, transportation location.
In retrospect, do you think it may have been a mistake to make Times Square a pedestrian zone?
To make Times Square what?
Much more of a pedestrian zone.
No, I don't, because Times Square is an incredibly special public space for both its history, the symbolism, what makes that it speaks to New York, and we don't need all those cars crisscrossing on the bow tie. The problem that arose in 2015 to 2017, 18 before COVID, was that there was no way to it was chaos. It wasn't managed chaos, so that you had a lot of aggressive panhandlers. Panhandling is legal in New York. Aggressive panhandling is not. And it was a particular problem to manage because the way you can arrest anybody for aggressive panhandling, you have to see it. And it's pretty hard to see it. And it's pretty hard to identify one Mickey Mouse when there are 20 with masks on. So that the Times Square bid and the NYPD had a lot of issues with how to kind of handle the chaos is normal in Times Square, but this was sort of elevated. I actually think that COVID found the answer, which is a lot of the costume characters who no longer had a business because Times Square was really empty, have disappeared. They had to earn, many of them were undocumented, and they needed income to support a family, and they must have found other means because it's not overbearing, at least in the times I've been in Times Square. We're talking about, at the height, the Times Square bid on a Saturday had counted about 164 costume characters, if I got my number right, or close to it. That didn't count the vendors selling all sorts of legal and illegal stuff, the false monks trying to sell you salvation, or, a certain amount of chaos is what Times Square is about. But I think the answer wouldn't have been to turn it back to cars. Question is how to find a way to manage it and create more activity so there's not this void where all the costume characters soak up the space. Pardon me? I know they're still there. I know they're still there, but I'm not sure that they're there as numbers. But again, every time I go is during the day. I haven't been there at night.
He was asking about the naked.
What?
He was asking about the naked cowboy.
Oh, the Naked Cowboy has a business. He's there, but I'm not sure the Naked Cowgirl is there. Or, is she still there? The Naked Cowboy has a real business. He's a busker. That's what he does. Pardon me? He's advertising Trump. Oh, well, that's not the first time. You know, there were all sorts of provocative Trump. There were all sorts of provocative, I'm seriously good with a microphone. I don't know what's happening tonight. There are all sorts of provocative pro-Trump and anti-Trump signs in the 2016 election. He's probably out there again.
I'm Jill Anderson, and I am general counsel of Jamestown that now owns the One Times Square, has owned it since the late 1990s. And we're working full-time on the redevelopment of One Times Square, and would love for you to come, put on a hard hat, and take a tour. And I think if you would meet with the creative people who are working on that whole development of that building and all the ideas that they have for what's happening, and it needs to, open in the next 18 to 24 months. They would love to have some real New Yorkers come and visit. So you should do that.
I love building tours. I'll be happy to do that. Actually, I actually got about a few sentences about that project because that project and the new one, the TSF, it's sort of the new technological innovation of Times Square. We could talk afterwards.
This is how new books happen.
What?
This is how the next book happens.
I just have a quick question going back to what would make New Yorkers want to come back to Times Square. It made me think of, because I just heard a story about in Paris, the Champs-Élysées just being for tourists, and how are they going to get Parisians back to the Champs-Élysées? So it seems like the same issue of what would bring New Yorkers back to Times Square.
Going back to this gentleman's question, I would say you really have to get the office workers. You have to have a diverse set of activities in Times Square. It can't just be tourism. That was the thrust behind the 42nd Street redevelopment project. Yes, the office towers were going to pay the bill for the condemnation of the land, but it was the notion that you should have diverse activities in this center spot of Manhattan. So, you have you've got entertainment, you have the tourism, you still need the office, and you need the retail. You need the retail, not retail for New Yorkers. New Yorkers aren't going to buy clothes in Times Square. Okay, it's good. They could buy the tchotchkes. That's fine. We need tchotchke buyers. But you just do need, I think what I miss, and Meredith asked me this question, what I miss are what Adam Gottnick calls the weird stores. The stores like Colony Music and West 48th Street that had all the guitar stores and other kind of musical instruments. This was the business infrastructure for Times Square entertainment. We don't have any of that now. So much of it's on the internet. So, I don't have the answer to how you repopulate that kind of diversity. I do believe that the office space, I don't care if they're second-tier tenants, having workers in Times Square is important. You just need the diversity of activity. And the fact that you now have all these people, young people and other people living in Hell's Kitchen also filters through. It's not a separate enclave anymore. It is definitely a fluid part of West Midtown. And that will have effect, because it's not all tourists in Hell's Kitchen. There are a lot of, if my count is right, there was something like 19,000 units built in a really short period of time. There were an enormous number of high-rise projects. So I know this is sounding Pollyannish, but it takes time. Although I think that I do believe the Times Square bid has a very important role to play in managing the activity and the programming. They do some fabulous programming that draws New Yorkers. I don't know what the statistics are. I haven't asked lately, but it's a really important institutional entity that has a long-run view of what's needed in Times Square beyond the tourism.
Well, as we're all thinking about the future of Times Square and we're informed by everything that you shared with us tonight, I think it's a good time to wrap up our conversation, although I wish we could just keep going, but people have to have dinner, I suppose. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I hope that you will be back at the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library so that we can be the primary source for your next project, perhaps even a consultation of Lynne's own collection. This is the last primary source program of our spring series, but we'll be back in September. So I encourage you to take a look at our website to see upcoming programs later when they're posted for later in the fall, or all of our programs are recorded and you can check them out online. If you'd like to grab a bookmark by the door on your way out, that also has links to our library's website so you can learn more about the fantastic resources that we offer. And then, of course, on your way out, I recommend stopping by the store on the first floor to pick up a signed copy of Lynne's book. If you're curious of the teaser that you've had tonight from our conversation. And with that, I just want to thank Lynne
Thank you.
for sharing her time with us tonight.
And I
So
wanna
let's give her a
thank
hand.
you.